A few years ago, almost nobody had heard of Embark Studios. They were just a studio that had some former industry veterans. Today, they're one of the most talked about multiplayer developers in gaming. They've released The Finals, a first-person shooter that immediately grabbed players' attention because of its insane destruction and chaotic gameplay. Then they followed it up with Arc Raiders, an extraction shooter that is a completely different kind of multiplayer experience that proved the studio wasn't afraid to take risks. But what makes Embark really interesting isn't just the games they've made. It's the philosophy behind the company itself. This is a studio that genuinely seems obsessed with pushing multiplayer games forward, whether that's through destruction systems, player-driven gameplay, or experimenting with entirely new ideas. And honestly, in an industry where so many studios play things safe now, that ambition alone makes them worth paying attention to. But here's the thing. Gaming history is filled with ambitious studios that looked incredibly promising at first, and then slowly disappeared. So the real question is, can Embark Studios actually become the next legendary multiplayer developer, or are they simply another ambitious studio that eventually fades away? Because after looking into their history, their games, their successes, their struggles, and what they're planning next, I honestly think the answer might surprise people. There are some game studios that release games, and then there are studios that feel like they're trying to change the gaming industry itself. Embark Studios feels like one of those developers. To understand Embark, you need to understand the gaming landscape around 2018. At the time, multiplayer gaming was becoming increasingly dominated by live service titles. Games like Fortnite, Apex Legends, Rainbow Six Siege, and Call of Duty were reshaping the industry. Publishers wanted games that could survive for years instead of months. But there was also a growing feeling among players that many AAA studios were becoming too corporate, too safe, and too focused on monetization. And that's where Embark entered the conversation. But you need to understand the people behind it. The company was founded in 2018 by Patrick Söderlund, a former EA executive and one of the most recognizable names connected to DICE and the Battlefield franchise. And honestly, that matters a lot, because when players first heard about Embark, they immediately connected the studio to the golden era of Battlefield games. Large-scale destruction, chaotic multiplayer moments, immersion-focused gameplay, and systems that created memorable experiences naturally, instead of relying on scripted moments. A lot of the developers joining Embark came from DICE as well, which meant expectations for the studio were incredibly high from the beginning. But what made Embark stand out early on wasn't just the talent behind it, it was the vision. Instead of simply announcing a game immediately, Embark talked about the future of game development itself. The company discussed ideas like machine learning tools, procedural systems, cloud-based development, and ways to make multiplayer worlds feel more dynamic and reactive. And honestly, at the time, some players were skeptical. Whenever a studio starts talking heavily about technology instead of gameplay, gamers usually get nervous. People have seen too many companies overpromise before, but at the same time, there was still excitement surrounding Embark because these weren't inexperienced developers trying to sound ambitious. They were veterans who had already helped shape some of the biggest multiplayer franchises in gaming history. Not long after the studio was founded, Nexon invested heavily into Embark and eventually acquired the company while still allowing the studio to maintain creative freedom. That combination was huge because it gave Embark something most new studios never get: massive financial backing, while still having room to experiment, and that freedom would become extremely important later on. The company repeatedly emphasized one core idea. They wanted multiplayer games to feel less scripted, more unpredictable, and player-driven. When you look at both the Finals and Arc Raiders today, you clearly see the philosophy everywhere. Both games are built around new gameplay. The idea that memorable moments should happen naturally because of player interaction and game systems, not because developers scripted every second of the experience. That's probably the biggest thing Embark carried over from the Battlefield DNA. The best moments in Battlefield were never scripted campaign sequences. They were the random multiplayer moments players created themselves. A collapsing building, a last-second objective steal, a helicopter crashing into a skyscraper. And Embark clearly understood how powerful those moments could be. Then came the game that truly put Embark on the map. The Finals changed everything for them. When the Finals was first revealed, it immediately caught people's attention. Not because it looked realistic, not because it looked tactical, but because it looked completely insane. The environmental destruction brought people in. The game looked like absolute chaos in the best way possible. And unlike many modern shooters that feel grounded and military inspired, The finals felt like a giant game show mixed with a futuristic action movie. That identity helped it stand out immediately. The game officially launched in December 2023 as a free-to-play multiplayer first-person shooter, and at launch, the game exploded in popularity. For a while, it genuinely felt like everyone was talking about it. Streamers were covering it nonstop, clips went viral constantly, and players were fascinated by how fresh the game felt compared to other shooters on the market. So, what is the finals? At its core, the finals is a competitive team-based first-person shooter where squads fight to steal and cash out money inside destructible arenas. But honestly, describing it like that doesn't fully explain why the game became popular. The real appeal was the unpredictability. You could never fully rely on the environment around you. Building that felt safe 1 second could collapse the next. Entire strategies could disappear instantly because of destruction. And that chaos became the identity of the game itself. The finals felt designed for players who loved fast-paced multiplayer gameplay, movement systems, creative strategies, and high-energy action. That unpredictability became the game's biggest strength. Fans of games like Battlefield, Apex Legends, Titanfall, and even Overwatch-style class systems would probably enjoy it immediately. But at the same time, the game wasn't for everyone. Players looking for a slower tactical realism sometimes struggled with how chaotic matches became. But honestly, that chaos was exactly what made the game memorable. One of the biggest accomplishments of the finals was simply managing to stand out in today's FPS market. That's incredibly difficult now. Most multiplayer shooters launch and disappear within weeks, but the finals immediately created a unique identity for itself. The destruction system became the headline feature, and visually the game looked incredible. Embark's technical expertise was obvious. The studio also committed heavily to the live stream service model. The game received seasonal updates, new maps, cosmetics, weapons, balance changes, and new gameplay content designed to keep players returning. But like almost every live service game, the finals also faced struggles. After huge launch numbers, player retention became one of the biggest challenges. Many players were using the overpowered meta loadouts, which included heavy classes using explosive barrels with C4 on it, and dominating medium weapons made matches repetitive. Balancing all of the weapons and gadgets became a priority. Some people found it unfriendly for solos, which can be an issue for every FPS. However, in the finals, you need to do more than just try to get kills. You need to work as a team to get the objective. Some players wanted more updates to introduce fresh maps, balance patches, and new casual modes. And they did have some performance issues around launch. Server latency, packet loss, and high visual cluster made the game frustrating to run and play competitively. Still, one thing remained consistent. Even players who stopped actively playing the game often still respected it. And now that many of the issues have been getting fixed since its launch, more players have been slowly returning. And honestly, that matters more than people realize. After the finals, Embark faced a major question. Could the studio prove they were more than just a one-hit wonder? And that's where Arc Raiders entered the picture. Arc Raiders was the first game that Embark had actually started working on. Arc Raiders was originally announced all the way back in 2021 as a competitive sci-fi shooter, but during development, the game changed dramatically. Embark eventually transformed the project into a PvPvE extraction shooter. That decision was risky because some players were immediately disappointed. Many people were excited for a purely cooperative experience. And extraction shooters already had a reputation for being extremely hardcore and unforgiving. But Embark believed the genre would shift to create more tension, more replayability, and more meaningful gameplay moments. Eventually, the gamble paid off. The game finally launched in 2025. Arc Raiders takes place in a post-apocalyptic future where giant mechanized threats known as Arc machines have devastated the world. Players enter zones to gather resources, fight enemy machines, battle other players, and attempt to safely extract with their loot. The atmosphere became one of the game's strongest features. The world felt tense, lonely, and dangerous. You never truly felt safe. Even if you survived against AI enemies, another squad could appear at any moment and steal everything you've collected. Some players are willing to work together, and others try to gain your trust just to take you out when you're not looking. The constant tension became the core identity of Arc Raiders. The game appealed heavily to players who enjoyed extraction shooters, survival gameplay, tactical teamwork, loot progression, and high-risk experiences. Fans of Escape from Tarkov, Hunt Showdown, and similar PvPvE games would probably feel comfortable immediately, but it also allowed more players to try the genre, as some of the most well-known extraction shooters like Escape from Tarkov is not available to play on console. Arc Raiders also tried to make the extraction genre more accessible to newer players. That may have been one of Embark's smartest decisions, because extraction shooters are notoriously difficult for casual players to get into. Arc Raiders tried to create tension without becoming completely overwhelming. The game officially launched on October 30th, 2025 for PC, PlayStation 5, and Xbox Series X and S. Surprisingly, it performed extremely well. The game reportedly reached massive player numbers shortly after launch and quickly became one of the biggest extraction shooters on the market. Critics generally responded positively as well. A lot of players praised the atmosphere, sound design, gunplay, and environmental storytelling. Some even called it one of the best extraction shooters available. And perhaps most importantly, the game proved Embark could succeed outside of traditional FPS design. That's a huge deal for such a young studio, even though the team was made up from industry leaders. But again, success doesn't mean perfection. Arc Raiders faced criticism too. Some players disliked the genre shift from co-op shooter to extraction shooter. Some players felt third-party perspective created frustrating combat situations. Others felt certain balancing systems needed improvement. And as with any live service multiplayer game, balancing progression, rewards, updates, and long-term engagement became an ongoing challenge. More recently, the player base have been frustrated with cheaters within the game. But one thing Embark deserves credit for is their willingness to delay and adjust projects when necessary. The studio reportedly spent years refining Arc Raiders because they felt the earlier versions of the game simply weren't good enough yet. A lot of publishers would never make that decision, especially a new studio. Many companies would release the game to try to get some money flowing into the company. Embark chose to keep improving it instead. At this point, Embark has built a very specific reputation in gaming. This feels like a studio genuinely trying to experiment. They feel like a studio trying to push multiplayer games forward. Whether people agree with every decision or not, you can clearly see the ambition. That's becoming increasingly rare in modern AAA gaming. A lot of major studios play things safe now. Sequels, remakes, trend chasing, copying monetization systems, following whatever genre happens to be popular at the moment. But Embark's games feel different. Not always perfect, but different. And I think players notice that. Even when games have flaws, there's still a feeling that the developers are trying to push ideas forward instead of simply copying competitors. And it is evident that they are trying to do their best in improving the games. So the big question becomes, what happens next? Right now, Embark appears heavily focused on supporting both the finals and Arc Raiders with long-term live service updates. The finals continues receiving seasonal content, Arc Raiders continues evolving through gameplay updates, progression changes, and major expansions. However, recent reports suggest that Embark has already started early development on 2 additional unannounced projects, which will be funded by the massive success of Arc Raiders. That's where things really get exciting, because now the studio has something incredibly valuable: experience as a team. They've launched a competitive FPS, they've launched an extraction shooter, they've built live service infrastructure, they've learned what works and what doesn't. And if they combine all of those lessons into future projects, the next game could be massive. But what could these 2 games look like? Right now, there are no official details about these future projects. But based on Embark's history, we can probably make some educated guesses. The studio clearly loves emergent gameplay, multiplayer systems, destruction, social experiences, large-scale immersion, and replayability. So it wouldn't be surprising if future games continue exploring multiplayer-focused worlds, possibly even larger ones. Some fans speculate the studio could eventually attempt something closer to a persistent online sandbox or MMO-style shooter experience. Others think they may continue experimenting within the PvPvE systems. And given Embark's technical focus, it wouldn't be shocking if their next games push environmental interaction even farther than the finals already does. I think the reason so many gamers continue paying attention to Embark comes down to one thing: potential. Even people who don't actively play their games often still want to see what the studio does next, because there's a feeling that Embark might eventually create something truly genre-defining, not just popular, but influential, the same way Battlefield once changed multiplayer shooters. And maybe that sounds ambitious, but honestly, ambition is kind of the entire point of this studio. So after everything we've talked about, what's the actual answer? Can Embark Studios really become the next legendary multiplayer developer? I think they genuinely have a potential to do it. Not because every game they've made has been perfect, not because they've already dominated the industry, but because they feel ambitious in a time where many studios don't. The finals proved they could create something unique enough to stand out in one of the most overcrowded genres of gaming. Arc Raiders proved they weren't afraid to evolve, pivot, and experiment with completely different ideas. And maybe most importantly, Embark still feels hungry. With 2 more games on the way, they still feel like a studio trying to build the future instead of protecting the past. Now, does that guarantee success? Absolutely not. Gaming history is filled with ambitious developers that eventually collapse under pressure. Live service gaming is brutal. Player expectations are massive, and the multiplayer market becomes more competitive every year. The reason so many players are still watching Embark closely is because there's this feeling that they could eventually create something truly special. Not just popular, not just successful, but influential. The kind of multiplayer game people look back on years later and say, that changed the industry. And whether Embark eventually reaches that level or not, I think they've already accomplished something important. They made people excited about experimentation again. They made multiplayer games feel unpredictable again. So maybe Embark Studios becomes the next legendary multiplayer developer. Or maybe they become one of gaming's most fascinating stories. But either way, the entire industry is watching what they do next. And after everything they've built, it's hard not to watch too. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, leave a like or subscribe down below. It would truly mean a lot. Let me know in the comments what studio you want me to focus on next. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.
Whoa, whoa. Here I come. Oh, here I come. Oh.